Look, I get it. Another Trump removal video. You've heard this before. Nothing happened. I thought the same thing until 3 hours ago when something crossed my desk that I've never seen in 40 years of studying American politics. I'm putting my reputation on the line tonight. If what I'm about to tell you doesn't happen within 48 hours, screenshot this video and remind me I was wrong, because I've never been more certain about anything in my career. A closed door emergency meeting of the House Judiciary Committee has just been convened. But this isn't political grandstanding. This is constitutional collapse in real time, and your savings account is about to witness the fallout. I've built my entire career on careful analysis, measured predictions, and avoiding hyperbole. I've survived 4 decades in political commentary by being right more often than I'm wrong. My colleagues know me as the cautious one, the analyst who waits for confirmation, who demands evidence, who refuses to engage in speculation. That's why what I'm about to tell you should terrify you, because I don't make predictions like this lightly. Here's what most people don't understand. While you were sleeping last night, foreign governments quietly moved $127 billion out of U.S. Treasury bonds. Not because of interest rates or inflation, because international investors are fleeing a country where the president openly defies federal court orders. This isn't normal market volatility. This isn't investors repositioning portfolios based on economic indicators. This is foreign governments making calculated decisions that the United States has become a constitutional risk. When sovereign wealth funds from traditionally stable allies like Norway, Singapore, and the UAE start liquidating American assets simultaneously, it signals something far more dangerous than economic uncertainty. It signals a fundamental loss of confidence in American institutional stability. Think about what that means. These are the same governments that held U.S. treasuries through the 2008 financial crisis, through multiple debt ceiling standoffs, through government shutdowns and credit rating downgrades. They held through all of that, but they're selling now. Why? Because economic crises are temporary, constitutional crises are existential. This morning, I received a classified briefing that sent tremors through every intelligence agency in Washington. I've never been read into something this sensitive, not during Watergate, not during Iran-Contra, never. That alone should tell you how grave this moment has become. The briefing lasted 3 hours. Senior intelligence officials, some with 30 and 40 years of experience, sat in that room with visible concern on their faces. These are people who've managed crises across multiple administrations, who've navigated conflicts from the Cold War through the War on Terror, and they're worried, genuinely, deeply worried. When career intelligence professionals abandon their carefully maintained neutral demeanor, you know the threat is real. Don't take my word for it. Right now, call the congressional switchboard at 2022-243121. Ask them about the emergency judiciary session. Ask them about the constitutional violation assessment. See what they tell you. I'll wait while you make that call, because what you're about to discover will reshape how you understand presidential power forever. Go ahead, pick up your phone, dial those numbers. When the operator answers, ask them directly, is there an emergency House Judiciary Committee session scheduled? Ask them, has there been a constitutional violation assessment requested? Listen to their response. Listen to how they hesitate, how they carefully choose their words, how they redirect your call. That hesitation tells you everything you need to know. Let me walk you through the constitutional earthquake that shattered Washington yesterday. 4 days ago, Donald Trump didn't just ignore a federal court injunction. He publicly declared it void and ordered federal agencies to proceed with actions the court explicitly prohibited. Not delayed compliance, not appealed the ruling, complete defiance. This wasn't a procedural misstep. This wasn't a communication breakdown between agencies. This was a deliberate, calculated rejection of judicial authority. Trump looked at a federal court order, a legally binding instruction issued by a constitutionally appointed judge, and said, "No, I don't recognize your authority." These weren't administrative delays or procedural disputes. Trump instructed the Department of Homeland Security to implement policies that Federal District Judge Patricia Williams had ruled unconstitutional and immediately enjoined. The court didn't suggest these policies were problematic. The court didn't recommend modifications. The court declared them unconstitutional and ordered their immediate cessation. That's the strongest action a federal judge can take. When DHS lawyers objected, citing their oath to the Constitution, Trump fired 3 senior officials on the spot. These weren't political appointees serving at the president's pleasure. These were career civil servants with decades of experience, lawyers who had served under multiple administrations, professionals who understood their primary obligation was to the Constitution, not to any individual president. Their dismissals sent shockwaves through federal agencies nationwide. Career officials across government saw the message clearly. Constitutional compliance will cost you your job. The chilling effect on federal employees cannot be overstated. How many other officials are now staying silent, unwilling to risk their careers by pointing out constitutional violations? When the court issued a clarifying order reaffirming its injunction, Trump didn't seek higher court review. He attacked Judge Williams personally, questioned her citizenship, and declared that activist judges have no authority over presidential decisions. Let that sink in. The President of the United States publicly questioned a federal judge's citizenship as justification for ignoring her ruling. This isn't legal strategy. This is authoritarian playbook. When leaders in failing democracies want to undermine judicial independence, they attack judges personally. They question their legitimacy, their patriotism, their right to serve. We've seen this pattern in Hungary and Poland and Turkey and Venezuela. We never thought we'd see it in America. That's not a president operating within constitutional boundaries. That's a president explicitly rejecting them. And that's why constitutional scholars across the political spectrum are using words they've never used before: presidential coup, judicial nullification, constitutional emergency. I've reached out to dozens of constitutional law experts over the past 24 hours, professors from Harvard, Yale, Stanford, the University of Chicago, conservative scholars from the Federalist Society, liberal scholars from the American Constitution Society, and for the first time in my career, they're using identical language regardless of their political orientation. That consensus should alarm every American. Because what most Americans don't understand is that markets only function when legal systems are predictable. American economic power isn't built on natural resources or manufacturing capacity. It's built on institutional reliability and rule of law. Destroy that foundation and trillions in global investment evaporate overnight. The United States doesn't have the largest oil reserves. We're not the world's biggest manufacturer. We don't have the largest population or the most abundant natural resources. What we have is something far more valuable: institutional credibility. When investors anywhere in the world want safety, they buy U.S. treasuries. When corporations want legal certainty, they incorporate in Delaware. When nations want to store value, they hold dollars. Why? Because for nearly 250 years, America has demonstrated that our legal system is reliable. Courts operate independently, contracts are enforceable, property rights are protected, constitutional limits are respected. That reliability is worth more than all the oil in Saudi Arabia, all the manufacturing capacity in China, all the gold in Fort Knox. But that credibility isn't permanent. It's not guaranteed. It's earned through consistent respect for legal institutions, and it can be destroyed in days if those institutions are undermined. This isn't just a legal crisis anymore. It's an existential threat to America's financial credibility. Currency values, bond prices, stock markets, they all rest on a foundation of institutional trust. When that trust erodes, the economic consequences cascade faster than any central bank can contain. We're not talking about a recession. We're talking about a fundamental repricing of American assets based on constitutional risk. While we've been focused on domestic constitutional drama, emergency calls have flooded embassy communications worldwide. Putin summoned his Security Council for an unscheduled session yesterday. Xi Jinping moved Chinese military assets to elevated readiness status. They understand what Washington is only beginning to grasp. America's constitutional breakdown represents the greatest strategic opportunity in decades. Think about what our adversaries see right now. They see an American president rejecting court authority. They see a Congress paralyzed by partisan division. They see intelligence agencies concerned about domestic stability. They see allies questioning security commitments. This is the moment they've been waiting for. Russian military intelligence has been gaming scenarios for American constitutional crisis for years. Chinese strategists have written extensively about how to exploit American institutional weakness. Iranian hardliners have predicted the collapse of American democracy since 1979. Now they're watching their predictions materialize in real time, and they're preparing to act, not with military invasion, not with direct confrontation, but with strategic positioning that takes advantage of American distraction and institutional chaos. When the world's leading democracy is consumed by constitutional crisis, authoritarians advance. This catastrophe has shattered the Republican Party's leadership structure completely. The moment Trump rejected federal judicial authority, the GOP was forced into an impossible choice: defend constitutional governance or defend Trump's authoritarian claims. For decades, the Republican Party has positioned itself as the party of constitutional originalism, of respect for institutional limits, of law and order. Conservative legal scholars built entire careers arguing for judicial restraint and executive accountability. The Federalist Society became the most influential legal organization in America by championing constitutional principles. Now, all of that is being tested. Can you claim to support constitutional governance while defending a president who ignores court orders? Can you argue for judicial authority while attacking judges who rule against your preferred policies? Can you advocate for law and order while embracing executive lawlessness? The cognitive dissonance is tearing the party apart. Intelligence reports from January 15th reveal how catastrophically this played out behind closed doors. Trump erupted at Republican House members who suggested appealing the court ruling instead of defying it. He called Speaker Johnson's constitutional arguments weak-minded betrayal. He publicly declared that Johnson was worse than Pelosi ever was. According to sources in the room, Trump's rage was unlike anything they'd witnessed. He pounded the table. He called constitutional compliance loser talk. He told representatives who raised legal concerns that they were part of the problem, not part of the solution. The meeting, scheduled for 30 minutes, lasted nearly 2 hours as Trump berated anyone who suggested following legal process. And he didn't keep this private. He posted these attacks on Truth Social during a live House Republican meeting, humiliating the speaker in real time. That public destruction sent terror through GOP leadership because it proved no Republican official is safe from Trump's wrath if they choose constitutional law over personal loyalty. Think about what that means for governance. Every Republican member of Congress now knows that prioritizing constitutional compliance over Trump's demands will result in public humiliation, primary challenges, and career destruction. How can they take their oath to defend the Constitution when doing so means political suicide? This isn't the first time we've seen this pattern. He destroyed Attorney General Sessions for recusing himself per Justice Department ethics rules. He turned on Vice President Pence for refusing to violate his constitutional oath on January 6th. He abandoned countless Republican officials the moment they prioritized legal obligations over personal fealty. Sessions' recusal was legally required. Justice Department regulations designed to prevent conflicts of interest and protect prosecutorial independence mandated that he step aside from the Russia investigation. Sessions, a career prosecutor before entering politics, understood his ethical obligations, and Trump never forgave him for it. Pence faced an even starker choice on January 6th. Constitutional scholars across the spectrum, conservative and liberal alike, agreed that the vice president had no authority to reject electoral votes. Pence's own legal advisors, his chief of staff, his counsel, all confirmed that the Constitution gave him no such power. He could preside over the count, but he couldn't change the outcome. When Pence chose constitutional compliance, Trump sent a mob that chanted, "Hang Mike Pence." Think about that. The President of the United States effectively encouraged violence against his own vice president for refusing to violate the Constitution. The pattern is always identical. Loyalty to Trump ends the instant you acknowledge any authority higher than Trump himself. Now, Republican judges, prosecutors, and elected officials face the same ultimatum. Choose Trump or choose your constitutional oath. You cannot choose both. And increasing numbers are choosing Trump, not because they believe he's right, not because they think ignoring court orders is constitutional, but because they've seen what happens to those who resist. They've watched careers destroyed, reputations ruined, families threatened. The incentive structure now rewards constitutional violation and punishes legal compliance. Then something unprecedented occurred. Chief Justice Roberts issued a rare public statement defending federal judicial authority and warning against any attempt to undermine the constitutional separation of powers. When the Chief Justice breaks his traditional silence to defend institutional legitimacy, it signals constitutional crisis at the highest levels. John Roberts has spent his entire tenure as Chief Justice trying to keep the Supreme Court above politics. He's voted against his perceived ideological preferences to protect institutional credibility. He's publicly criticized both parties when they've attacked judicial independence. His entire judicial philosophy centers on preserving the court's authority through careful, incremental decision making. For Roberts to issue a public warning represents an abandonment of his normal restraint. It means the threat to judicial independence has become so severe that silence would be interpreted as acquiescence. It means the Chief Justice of the United States believes the constitutional separation of powers is under direct attack. The statement itself was carefully worded but unmistakably direct. Roberts didn't mention Trump by name, but everyone understood the target. He reminded Americans that federal courts derive their authority from the Constitution, not from political convenience. He emphasized that judicial independence is essential to constitutional governance. He warned that any attempt to nullify court orders threatens the foundation of American democracy. Coming from a Chief Justice who has spent years avoiding public controversy, the statement carried extraordinary weight. But none of this compares to the legal bombshell that detonated yesterday. Judge Williams didn't just hold Trump in contempt of court. She referred the matter to the Justice Department for criminal prosecution under federal obstruction statutes. When federal judges start seeking criminal charges against sitting presidents, the constitutional system is approaching total breakdown. Contempt of court is serious. It's the judiciary's primary mechanism for enforcing its authority. When someone defies a court order, judges can impose fines, sanctions, even jail time. But criminal referrals go far beyond contempt. They invoke federal statutes that carry significant prison sentences. Judge Williams cited specific violations: 18 U.S.C. Par 1503, obstruction of justice; 18 U.S.C. Par 1505, obstruction of proceedings before departments, agencies, and committees; and 18 U.S.C. paragraph 371, conspiracy to defraud the United States. Each statute carries potential prison time measured in years, not months. The referral included a detailed legal memorandum documenting Trump's actions. It quoted his public statements declaring court orders void. It referenced his orders to federal agencies to violate the injunction. It documented the firing of DHS officials who raised constitutional concerns. It cited his personal attacks on the judge as evidence of corrupt intent. This wasn't a political document. This was a federal judge sworn to uphold the Constitution, formally requesting criminal investigation of a sitting president for acts that threatened the constitutional order itself. Because this confrontation isn't only about Trump's defiance, it's about whether constitutional governance can survive a president who explicitly rejects constitutional limits. Every president in American history has operated under the understanding that federal courts have authority to check executive power. Washington accepted judicial review. Lincoln accepted judicial authority even while suspending habeas corpus during the Civil War. Nixon resigned rather than defy the Supreme Court's order to release the Watergate tapes. Even Nixon, facing certain impeachment, acknowledged that presidents must comply with court orders. Trump is rejecting that fundamental principle, and if he succeeds, if presidential defiance of federal courts becomes normalized, the entire constitutional structure collapses. The House Judiciary Committee isn't just meeting to discuss contempt citations. They're meeting to determine whether Donald Trump has committed high crimes that warrant immediate removal from office. This is no longer about policy disagreements or political theater. This is about whether a president can simply nullify judicial decisions whenever they become inconvenient. The committee has subpoenaed documents from the Department of Homeland Security, the White House counsel's office, and the Department of Justice. They've requested testimony from the fired DHS officials. They've scheduled closed-door depositions with federal attorneys who raise constitutional concerns. They're building a comprehensive record of presidential defiance. Committee members from both parties are privately acknowledging the gravity of the situation. Even Republicans who have staunchly defended Trump on other matters are expressing concern about the precedent of ignoring court orders because they understand that if presidential nullification becomes acceptable, future presidents, Republican and Democrat alike, will exercise unchecked power. The constitutional implications transcend partisan advantage. Today's precedent becomes tomorrow's nightmare for whichever party is out of power. The political earthquake is already reshaping Washington. Trump's approval ratings have collapsed among suburban voters. Republican governors are privately distancing themselves from constitutional nullification. The party is fracturing into irreconcilable factions, constitutional conservatives demanding legal compliance and Trump loyalists embracing authoritarian governance. Polling conducted over the past 72 hours shows a 12-point drop in Trump's support among college-educated suburban voters, particularly suburban women. These voters, many of whom reluctantly supported Trump despite personal reservations, are drawing a line at constitutional defiance. They can accept policy disagreements, they can tolerate controversial rhetoric, but they cannot accept a president who rejects judicial authority. Republican governors in swing states are facing impossible political calculations. They built their careers on law and order messaging. They campaigned on constitutional principles and respect for institutions. Now they're being asked to defend presidential nullification of court orders. The political risk is enormous. Several governors have quietly reached out to Democratic counterparts, exploring bipartisan statements defending judicial independence. These conversations, unthinkable just weeks ago, reflect the depth of Republican concern about constitutional precedent. Democrats have been handed the most powerful constitutional argument in American history. Every candidate in every race will now ask the same devastating question. Do you support a president who obeys federal courts or one who claims to be above them? And they'll have federal court orders and criminal referrals to back up their argument. This isn't abstract constitutional theory. This isn't debating the meaning of the Commerce Clause or arguing about executive privilege. This is a simple binary question that every voter can understand. Should presidents follow court orders or not? There's no middle ground. There's no nuanced position. You either support constitutional compliance or you don't. And Democrats will force every Republican candidate to answer. If this constitutional crisis reaches the Supreme Court, Chief Justice Roberts will confront the nightmare scenario he's spent his entire tenure avoiding. The court forced to choose between institutional survival and political accommodation. If the court upholds presidential immunity from judicial authority, it effectively ends constitutional governance. If it rules against Trump, he'll attack the Supreme Court itself as illegitimate, potentially triggering a constitutional collapse. Either outcome devastates American institutional credibility and global confidence in U.S. legal systems. The Supreme Court's authority rests entirely on public acceptance of its legitimacy. The court has no army, it controls no budget, it cannot enforce its own rulings. It depends on voluntary compliance from the executive branch and public respect for judicial decisions. If Trump refuses to comply with a Supreme Court ruling, what happens? Does the court issue another ruling? Does Congress try to enforce compliance? Does the military get involved? The Constitution provides no clear mechanism for compelling presidential obedience when a president simply refuses to acknowledge judicial authority. This is the constitutional nightmare scenario that kept the founders awake at night. They designed a system of checks and balances, assuming that officials would respect institutional boundaries. They couldn't imagine a president who would simply reject the entire framework. And if the Supreme Court rules in Trump's favor, granting presidents immunity from judicial oversight, every future president will exercise unchecked power. Liberal and conservative justices alike understand this threat. The precedent they set now will define presidential authority for generations. But there's one factor that transcends all political calculations: international capital flows. Foreign investors don't care about partisan politics. They care about legal predictability and institutional stability. They invest in countries where contracts are enforceable, where court decisions are respected, where constitutional systems function reliably. If America becomes a country where presidents can ignore federal courts, where legal rulings become negotiable, where constitutional limits become suggestions, international capital will flee faster than during any financial crisis in history. Because capital always flows toward legal certainty and away from institutional chaos, the global financial system holds approximately 7 trillion in US Treasury bonds. International investors own roughly 8 trillion in US stocks. Foreign direct investment in American companies totals another $5 trillion. That's $20 trillion in foreign capital invested in America specifically because of our institutional reliability. What happens when that assumption proves false? What happens when foreign investors realize that American legal systems are no longer predictable? They don't wait for confirmation. They don't give us time to fix the problem. They move their capital to safer jurisdictions immediately. Consider the mechanics of capital flight. When sovereign wealth funds decide to divest, they don't announce their intentions. They quietly begin selling positions. When pension funds reassess constitutional risk, they don't hold press conferences, they adjust allocations. When central banks question the dollar's reliability, they don't issue warnings, they diversify their reserves. By the time capital flight becomes visible in market data, it's already too late to prevent the damage. The first wave of selling triggers algorithmic trading systems. Those automated systems detect unusual selling patterns and accelerate the trend. Before human traders can even assess the situation, billions in capital have already fled. And once capital flight begins, it creates a self-reinforcing cycle. Initial selling depresses asset prices, lower prices trigger more selling creates panic, panic accelerates the exodus. What starts as institutional reallocation becomes a stampede for the exits. Switzerland, Singapore, Germany, countries with stable legal systems and respect for institutional independence will see massive capital inflows. America will see the largest capital flight in modern financial history. But it's not just about where capital goes, it's about what happens to the assets left behind. When $20 trillion in foreign investment starts liquidating, who buys those assets? Domestic investors are also panicking. They're also questioning institutional stability. They're also reducing exposure to constitutional risk. The result is a bid-ask spread that collapses price discovery. Assets trade at distressed valuations, not because of economic fundamentals, but because of forced liquidation and vanishing buyers. Your retirement account loses 30, 40, 50% of its value, not because companies became less profitable, but because institutional confidence collapsed. I've analyzed every major financial crisis since the 1980s: Black Monday, the savings and loan collapse, the dot-com crash, the 2008 financial meltdown, the COVID market disruption, and I've never issued the warning I'm issuing tonight. If the United States allows presidential nullification of federal court orders to stand, we will witness the largest capital flight in global financial history, not because of economic fundamentals, but because of constitutional fundamentals. No international investor will risk their capital in a legal system where presidential whims override judicial decisions. Black Monday in 1987 was triggered by program trading and market mechanics. The savings and loan crisis resulted from regulatory failure and fraud. The dot-com crash followed unsustainable valuations. The 2008 crisis emerged from mortgage-backed securities and leverage. COVID caused a temporary shock followed by rapid recovery. All of these crises, as severe as they were, occurred within functioning legal systems. Investors knew that courts would enforce contracts. They understood that bankruptcy proceedings would follow established rules. They trusted that property rights would be protected. This crisis is different. This crisis threatens the legal infrastructure that makes modern financial markets possible. And that's why the consequences will dwarf anything we've seen before. This is why I'm making an unprecedented prediction. If Congress doesn't act within 48 hours to address this constitutional crisis, we will see emergency Federal Reserve interventions to prevent dollar collapse and international capital exodus. Your retirement funds, your home equity, your economic security all depend on foreign confidence that American legal institutions still function. The Federal Reserve is already gaming scenarios for emergency interventions. They're preparing swap lines with foreign central banks. They're reviewing the legal authorities available under crisis conditions. They're coordinating with the Treasury Department on potential market stabilization measures. This isn't speculation. This is preparation based on real threats to financial stability. When the Fed starts preparing emergency interventions during a period of relative economic calm, it signals that they see existential risks on the horizon.